This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter the most in their professional lives. And that journey often involves the effective translation of complicated research into engaging jargon-free communication. If you're interested in getting a free resource to help you do that, go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your very own free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, but not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for general audiences. It is such a great pleasure to have Dr. Tyler Parsons on the show today. Tyler is a medical scientist with strong communication and leadership skills who has more than 7 years of both preclinical and clinical oncology research spanning the academia and industry healthcare bridge. Tyler has a multidisciplinary scientific background in both solid and liquid tumor microenvironment biology. His Ph.D. research at Oakland University and the Beaumont Research Institute in Michigan included defining a mechanism of cell adhesion and maintenance of recruited stem cells to the tumor site and the resultant differentiation after loss of maintenance due to radiation therapy. Tyler's current postdoctoral fellowship research is at WashU Medical School in St. Louis. He has presented and won research awards at university, state, national, and international conferences, and is passionate about translating complex discoveries at the bench into understandable, tangible science to reach a broader audience for the ultimate goal of clinical application and improving patient outcomes. Welcome to the show, Tyler. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
You've had an unusual and interesting career journey so far, starting with your interest in being a lawyer focused on intellectual property. Could you describe for listeners how you found your way from an interest in a legal career to being a postdoc at Washington University School of Medicine?
Yes, that is correct. I always had kind of a pull or a draw towards being able to logically explain things and break things down logically. And I also had this love for science. And I, for the longest time, thought that a perfect way to mix those two things would be to go into law. I had taken some pre-LSAT tests and actually had taken the LSAT. And it wasn't until my junior year in college, I took a cancer biology class taught by Dr. Gerard Madlin-Bayan, who ended up being my PhD advisor. And it was the first time that someone had explained science or taught science to me in a way that was a story. It wasn't just facts that had to be memorized and trying to have a bunch of true false questions. It was the first time that a science test was kind of short answer or long answer, and being able to put things together, tie different pieces of the story together in something, an analogy that would often be said is it's science is a story that has been written and we are just turning the pages. And I think that was super interesting and grabbed my attention because all of a sudden it was, well, I want to keep reading. I want to keep turning these pages, and the way to do that is with research. So it was definitely his ability to effectively communicate the science that he was teaching and effectively communicate his research, which grabbed my attention, of course. And I ended up doing undergraduate research in his lab, and ended up staying in his lab for my PhD as well. And then as far as WashU, this is kind of a funny story. Dr. Grant Shallon, he's currently my PI at WashU. He reached out on Twitter. Job postings for postdocs can often be very boring and very cookie cutter. We're
Mhm.
looking for talented students who have a strong passion for some. Well, I mean, of course you are, right? But his tweet was something along the lines of, I'm looking for a moderately talented, somewhat intelligent poet. And just that a little bit of humor kind of
Uh-huh.
grabbed me because I certainly need humor. Science can get
Mhm.
very boring and technical. And I reached out to him and said, hey, I like I liked your tweet. I don't know much about blood research because at the time my dissertation was all solid tumor stuff, but I kind of worked with the same hematopoietic stem cell modeling during my PhD, and eventually one thing led to another, and here I am in St. Louis.
I love it. And I love your description of science is the story, and we're just turning the pages. It's already been written, and we just want to see how it turns out.
Right.
It's very, very vivid. I haven't heard it explained that way as well. I know listeners will appreciate that. Which kind of leads me into my next question. We had a chance to talk offline, and you mentioned that you were the first in your family to graduate college, really first in your generation. This does not include your wonderful siblings, by the way, and consequently, you're the first to earn a PhD. So you're a highly skilled communicator of your research. You've had a lot of experience explaining it in various domains, and in my work and on the show, I've started developing this working hypothesis that strong science communicators often are part of the first generation of their family to graduate college. And so we're going to test that theory a bit here to get your take on it. What do you think about that? And if you agree, which is definitely not required, why do you think that's the case?
I definitely agree with that, and I think there's two things that come to mind when you say that. First, I think your support system, your family and your friends, all throughout your journey as a first generation student, whether it be in science or not, but in my case, in science, those people around you want to be involved, and they keep asking you, how is classes going? What are you learning? When you start getting involved in research, I remember my junior year, I was asking, what does the lab do? And I gave probably the most atrocious description of what we do. But over time, you begin to um, fine tune those skills of being able to not just explain your science like you would at a conference or presenting an abstract, but you begin being able to develop the skill of breaking down your science for massively different audiences, whether
Mhm.
it be um, your family members who walk who work on the um, assembly line for an auto plant, or
Mhm.
you are describing it to undergrads who join your lab, and you're trying to explain what you do, or you're presenting at a conference. There's extremely different ways that you can explain the same thing, and you want those people to enjoy what you do. That you want those people to be interested in the research that you're doing. And I think being able to market your research to the different people, not just so when you're done talking about it, they say, "Oh yeah, that's really cool," but actually ask questions about it because you grabbed their attention in some way. I think not being surrounded by people who are doctors and people who are scientists, and not being surrounded by those people all growing up, you have to kind of be able to market what you're learning and your research better. So I think that's probably the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing, I think it has a lot to do with self-advocacy. I mentioned trying to market yourself, and I think that's kind of what I was thinking of here. Um, you have to market yourself for getting into labs. I mean, I didn't know that science research in academic settings was a thing until I got to college, really until I got into my sophomore and junior years. And no one is helping you or showing you how it's done, and you don't have these successful models to follow for success in higher learning and research, and you're kind of navigating it yourself. And as you do that, again, you get really good at saying the same thing over and over again, but getting a little better each time. And I think probably those two things is why you're noticing those first generation students being able to communicate a little better. It's because they have to.
Fascinating. That's really fascinating to me. And I also think it gives hope to others who aren't necessarily first in their generation to go to college, in the sense that one of the themes that I hear coming through is it's an iterative process, a lot of practice, a lot of explaining to different types of people. These are things that anyone can do, whether their parents are PhDs or they have a lot of folks in their community who have gone on and earned advanced degrees or not. It's that practice in these different environments. And the other thing that you said, Tyler, that I really want to highlight and ask you a follow-up about is when you're talking about sort of breaking down your research, almost like taking it apart in different ways for different audiences. I'm reminded of something that Carl Sagan, the patron saint of science communicators, perhaps, as well as, an amazing scientist in his own right for his research. One of the things he said was that because he did not necessarily grasp the concepts as quickly as some of his colleagues, as he explained, he really had to take apart the work and research for himself, and really sort of teach himself that those topics and those concepts, those principles, which in the process of doing that helped him communicate to this
Hmm.
wide array of people in such an imaginative, clear way. And I'm wondering just if you think that perhaps the process that you described, whether it's in your own particular case or just thinking about the topic more generally, has maybe informed your science in some way or affected your science in some way, maybe got you to think about a problem at the bench a little differently, because you're constantly taking it apart and putting it back together in different ways for various audiences.
I completely agree. I think that is one of the strong suits for a lot of scientists in the lab, whether it's presenting their work or just doing the bench work. I think that being able to deconstruct everything and know why you're doing what you're doing at each step not only is probably going to result in better outcomes for the research, but you will also be able to troubleshoot a lot better as well once everything's broken down and something's not working. And one of my mentors during my PhD would often say that the people that he hires in his lab, he prefers it to people who do not understand it the first time,
Mhm.
because people who need that second or third time, or they need to go to a whiteboard. That was me. I needed a whiteboard. I needed to draw everything out, and once I did that, I got it. Once I understood it, I was good, and I could troubleshoot, and I understood all the little fine details. But the people who sometimes just understand it or say they understand it the first time, it's more just of a surface level or more of an academic level of understanding, and not
Mhm.
necessarily that deeper piece by piece that, as you were mentioning, is something that you need to do depending on who you're giving your research talk to.
Yeah, thank you for that specific example too. Even as a seasoned and skilled science communicator that you are, you've still experienced challenges in sharing your research with general audiences. It's not easy, even for someone who has had a lot of practice and developed and built up some expertise in the area. I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit about, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced in sharing your research with folks who are not scientists or familiar with your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think these last couple of years is just a great example. It's a sad example, but it's a pretty glaring example of how sometimes, no matter how data looks to everyone, I mean, everyone has the same access to the same data, and everyone can look at it. But I think there are people that come down to conversations, and they already have their implicit and confirmation bias cards just laid out on the table
Mhm.
for you to see. And I think it honestly comes down to another pandemic that's going on right now, which is scientific illiteracy.
Mm.
I think there is kind of a shift, and I'm hoping that as more people have access to education, this kind of gets pushed out in the next generation or so. But I think just thinking of examples from my research and me just talking to people, I mentioned stem cells, and there's this potential to be such an inflammatory word when I'm just talking about adult stem cells that everyone has,
Mm.
or because I'm a cancer guy, I'm asked very sincerely if I believe that there's a cure for cancer locked up in a vault somewhere, and there's just too much money to be made in treating people. And all of these things make it very difficult. These are obstacles that you have to get over really
Mhm.
before you can have any kind of fruitful conversation. Talking about that scientific illiteracy, I was riding the train the other day, and there were two people sitting in front of me, and they were talking about how their uncle had passed away early in his life. He was in his mid 50s, and it was because of all the TV dinners, all those frozen dinners that he would eat throughout his life. Which, I mean, that probably had something to do with it. But then they took the next jump and said it's because of all of the genes that those foods added to his body.
Uh,
I just think it's things like that that you have to be able to have everyone come together with the same set of facts before you can really have any kind of fruitful conversation.
mm,
And I think that has probably been the biggest challenge, and especially just the last couple of years, as unfortunately the COVID pandemic was happening as I was completing my PhD and people were getting more and more familiar with me. I was getting a lot of questions. I was getting a ton of masks and viruses and vaccines, and I had to try to explain those things to very different people on
mhm.
both sides of the argument. And in a way, it helped me become more of an effective communicator, being able to realize that, look, there's going to be people that are automatically going to disagree with my premise. So now I need to work on delivering the data more effectively without getting too emotional about it.
Such an important point, and actually leads to my next question, because part of science communication, of course, is a comfort in speaking to diverse audiences from all different backgrounds and experiences. Did you have experience in that area as you were growing up?
Yeah, I did. I was involved in sports, which I know a lot of people were, but being able to lead a team was important and get out in front of fans and do that. But I think even more so than sports, one of my sisters, you mentioned earlier, two of my sisters, both uh, have a college degree. One is in music and one is in public speaking and
Mhm.
drama. And kind of following in their footsteps, they're quite a bit older than me. I was involved in a lot of music. I took lessons for 5 instruments growing up, and my other sister kind of pulled me into. I wasn't kicking and screaming, though. I definitely liked it. Public speaking, and
Mhm.
just from a young age, getting involved in acting out scenes in front of people and doing competitions and recitals for uh, the music and the piano and all the different public speaking, the drama, getting up in front of people and doing that over and over again from
Mhm.
such a young age, all the way through college. I think that even though it wasn't science, like you mentioned, it's part of that obstacle to get over in communication is to not get all nervous when you're up in front of people. And I think growing up doing all of those things, while yeah, I don't have a career in piano performance, or I'm not a actor on Broadway, and I'm certainly not a professional athlete, I still learned a lot of my communication skills kind of inadvertently from doing those things growing up.
I love it. I think that's just, absolutely fantastic. Really interesting part of what you bring to your research now. And you're also interested, and you've had experience in public policy, particularly as a leader in student government activities. And as you know, getting involved in science policies really attracting increasing attention across the scientific spectrum among natural and social sciences scientists. Of course, COVID is a part of that, and misinformation and things like that as well, and how to combat these lies and distortions, also a part of it, of course. um, Delivering science policy training, is one of the focus points of what I do. And as a scientist and science policy person that you are, what do you think key success factors are, and maybe even pitfalls to avoid with respect to the policy landscape?
Mhm. I think the first thing that came to mind, just as you were reading that, a pitfall to avoid, I kind of touched on it earlier, is to avoid the assumption that you are both coming to the conversation with the same set of data, the same set of
Mhm,
facts.
mhm,
Um, you have no idea where the other person got their stuff from. So There's been a couple times this last couple years where somebody wanted me to talk to somebody else who was kicking and screaming about certain things with COVID. And the first thing that I always did was I would love to have this conversation with them. But first, like I'm going to share the stuff that I'm going to be citing during the conversation. Can you share your stuff? And often it was such a difference in where I was coming from and where they were coming from, and where those data sets ended up taking our beliefs and how we felt about things. And I think that is definitely a huge pitfall that you have to avoid, is just assuming that the other party or the other group that you're trying to get to not just convince them to see your way, but if we're talking about science policy, I mean, if we're going to try to implement something that's for the betterment of everybody, we need to make sure that everybody has the same information with which we are trying to make this policy. And I think the student government you mentioned I was involved in, I was involved in that for many years. I started a lot of organizations, and now I'm on the policy committee at WashU's Postdoc Executive Council, and you just have an opportunity to be around so many people that have similarities with you, but are so different from you, and people that come from such different backgrounds, such different fields, and being able to try to wrap up everything and focus it into a point that can benefit everybody was something that really wasn't part of my science training. It wasn't part of my undergrad in biology or PhD, but it was a huge part in my education that led me, I believe, to being better at sitting down and talking with people about science.
That's just wonderful. And there are two things that you said that struck me in particular. One was beliefs. The word you used was beliefs, and then how people feel. Certainly feelings, which goes to emotion. Both so important and embedded in how we view things, but often left out of any kind of discussion, not acknowledged or even recognized as being an input. At least most important decisions these days are not made by algorithm, at least as we're talking in 2021. We'll see how that goes. But this recognition of emotions and feelings, I think, is a key component in attacking and hopefully debunking a lot of misinformation.
Right.
Yeah,
of
I'm
course.
sorry,
I think the emotions are always going to trump data. I mean, data is boring, and if you can somehow through effective communication get your data to be convincing to people, then you might be able to get them to be a little more emotional about the story that data is telling. I think a lot of times when it comes to this is how I feel, and that is going to be such a stronger feeling, such a stronger emotion than, yeah, but this graph, right? So I think that, yeah, you have to go into conversations, and you have to go into, especially, this question was about policy, going into policy, whether it be for just a university or a state or some kind of local ordinance or even federal, that you have to go into it realizing that you're dealing with people. These aren't robots that, oh well, yep, the graph does say that, I'm going to change my algorithm, like you were saying. These are people, and for whatever reason, on both sides, for whatever reason, somebody firmly believes something, and being able to deconstruct that is a lot of times step one, and very important, before then attacking with your graphs and p-values.
Thanks for that, Tyler. As we wrap up, you and I connected as a result of a recent powerful and inspiring post that you put up on LinkedIn. For listeners who aren't familiar with it, could you share your story?
Sure. Yeah, this is really interesting. At least I think it is. I often say that it's a really interesting story. I just necessarily wish that it wasn't mine. I, as you mentioned earlier, am at WashU, and my research really focuses on myeloproliferative neoplasms, which is a specific type of blood cancer, kind of pretty rare, and the transformation of that disease into secondary acute myeloid leukemia. There's a lot of genetic drivers that make that happen. The most prominent is a mutation on your JAK gene V617F. And my research really focuses on trying to elucidate some of those mutations that drive that transformation from MPN to AML.
Mhm.
And interestingly enough, I happen to be an MPN patient with this same mutation that I'm studying in the lab. In 2012, I had an unprovoked deep vein thrombosis, a blood clot. Another one in 2019. All of my blood work came back as normal. I didn't have any kind of clotting problems. And then in last year, I had a unprovoked PVT, which is the portal vein in the liver. I was hospitalized for a while, and they eventually decided to test for this rare mutation, compounded rarity with how young I am. This is usually in patients in their 50s and above. And ultimately, I obviously got diagnosed. And so it's really interesting, and it has brought a whole new mindset to going to the lab. And sometimes getting in there and pipetting can be really monotonous. But I have always tried to keep in the forefront of my mind why I do what I do. I've been very fortunate. My Ph.D. advisor and now my postdoc advisor are both very clinically minded. They both try to tailor their research, the lab's research, as best as they can to keep in mind why we're doing what we're doing, which is ultimately for benefiting patient outcomes. But it's become very personal for me now, of course, to get in there and try to, whether it be drug discovery or elucidating different types of mutations, the driving mutations along the way that we would maybe be able to target, or at least clinical markers to use, because now it affects me. So I think that's really interesting. Like I said, I wish it wasn't my story, but I get to live with that, and that's fine. And I think it brings a whole different mindset to every day at the lab for me.
Tyler, thank you so much for sharing that story. It is so incredibly powerful and moving and emotional. And I think one of the things that you mentioned is the why. Why the research, regardless of what the research is, and keeping that in mind. And it's not necessarily just scientific research, of course. Why are we doing the things that we do, say, for a career? And keeping that in mind can provide some much needed perspective when it does get monotonous or hard, or things don't turn out the way we had hoped they would. And it's just such an amazing, yes, it's unusual dynamic that you're in, but I can think of no one better to be taking on this challenge than you. So I appreciate you sharing that with listeners, and of course wish you the highest success in both your lab work and also with respect to your own health. You've brought so many strands together in this conversation with respect to science policy, science communication, of course, obstacles that you've encountered and how you have overcome them. It's just been a fantastic opportunity to talk with you, and I know listeners will really appreciate it as well.
Yeah, it's been great. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
You're welcome. And listeners, thank you so much for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.